Help us to remember that there's no situation which you cannot help us, and no time in which you do not need your help. Grant us such wisdom of mind, such strength of will, such devotion of heart, may seek to do things that please you. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Say the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Good morning, honorable members. This House is in session. Minutes of the meeting on Tuesday, September the 27th, September 17th. Honorable member?
To be confirmed.
Minutes of Tuesday, September the 17th to be confirmed. Honorable member?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that the aforesaid minutes be confirmed.
Right here. It has been seconded. Member, what do we say now? If there are no corrections or observation, then let those minutes stand confirmed. All members in favor, please say aye.
Announcements by Your Honour. Messages from Her Excellency the President. Petitions, papers, government notices, private members' notices, notice of questions, reports from select committees, first reading of bills.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move the first reading of the Electric Supply Bill 2024, as well as the Sexual Offences Amendment Bill 2024. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I also beg to move the first reading of the Health Services Medical Reports Fees Validation Bill 2024 and the Merchant Shipping Bill 2024.
Question is that those bills were mentioned.
The question is that those bills so mentioned be read the first time. All those members in favor, please say aye. All those in favor, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
Ministers, congratulatory and obituary speeches, personal explanations, motions for leave of absence, oral replies to questions, notice of motions for the adjournment of the House on matters of urgent public importance, orders of the day.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I beg to move the suspension of standing orders 6, 16, 18, 20, 42, subsection 5, 43, and 44 for the remainder of the day's sitting.
Questions? The question is that those standing orders so mentioned be suspended for the remainder of the day's sitting. Those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
Government business. Order
Government
number
business
13.
is now the order of the day.
Order number 13, ma'am. This bill stands in the name of the Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade to move the second reading of the Electricity Supply Bill 2024.
Honourable Member for St. James Central. Not hearing you. Not hearing you.
I'm obliged to you, ma'am. And permit me as I begin to address the House to take the opportunity to compliment you, ma'am, on the lovely color that you are wearing. I confess that it was beating me off outside the off stump. I had to seek the guidance of the leader of government business, who assures me that it is in fact fuchsia. But it breaks the drab monotony and the dreariness of this place, ma'am, and I wanted to compliment you as I began.
Thank you very much, Honourable Member.
Now,
It says
Madam,
that senior citizens still are relevant. Thank you, sir.
Madam Deputy Speaker, this morning our business allows us to engage in a discussion on the energy policy of this country and on the broader matter of energy security for Barbados. And I welcome the opportunity, ma'am, to so engage. And effectively, I think it is an opportunity for us to take stock of where we are and hopefully to exchange some views on the national security matrix with respect to this sector. And it is, I pitch it there, ma'am, because perhaps more so than any other sector, this is one of those areas where Barbados as a whole, irrespective of our political and partisan complexion, and persuasion, may be inclined or may well be advised to see the broader national interest as we try to move towards leaving a fossil fuel-driven economy behind and in our wake and steering our course and our direction towards an economy which is driven by renewable energy. Now, the fact of the matter is, ma'am, that I said just now, it is really a national security issue for Barbados, above and beyond it being something that will obviously attract partisan political interests. And why do I say this? I say it, ma'am, because of the fact that all we have to do is to pause and to think through what energy in this country is all about. As we speak, obviously, the chamber is illuminated, and we take for granted that there is electricity, but the truth of the matter is, ma'am, that has to be driven by the fossil fuels which we procure, and oftentimes at great cost, and it must be distributed once it is procured. It has to be generated and then distributed around the island, and every installation of significance in Barbados relies thereon, so that our hospital, ma'am, cannot run, the surgical ward cannot function without electricity, the airport, ma'am, cannot bring in aircraft from the Grantley Adams International Airport's tower without electricity. Obviously, our police and defense services rely on it. The hotel and hospitality sector, transportation across the country, ma'am, relies on the energy supply. The agricultural sector is a big consumer of energy, if for no other reason that it is a big consumer of water, and we cannot generate and we cannot produce water without having a pull on and a draw on our electrical resources. And so therefore, ma'am, we are talking about the heartbeat of the economy of Barbados and the security of this country in many, many ways. And I take time to outline that in detail because I think that far too often, ma'am, what has been missing is the broad philosophical perspective of why this sector is so important, what government's philosophy is on the transformation of the sector, and the policies, ma'am, with respect to the perspectives we have on the sector and the broad context which is confronting Barbados. And with respect to the philosophical perspective, ma'am, permit me to say that I consider it to be critical that we take the country into confidence with respect to the totality of the circumstances which are confronting us. And ma'am, it is not, I do not say that lightly. The philosophical perspective of the government is that there should be a sharing of perspective on both the opportunities, ma'am, and the challenges. And there is a wide range of opportunity which exists out there only to be harvested from the renewable energy policies of this administration. But equally, I feel it is important in this debate to be candid and to be forthright with the country and to take the country into my confidence, not to obfuscate, ma'am, not to shield the sector from scrutiny, but ma'am, to be very candid about some of the challenges which confront us. Because, as I said, it is too large, too significant, too important to Barbados for this to be seen only in the light of a success of one political party or another. And I think, ma'am, that it is therefore worthy of a more substantive engagement. Now, one of the distinguishing characteristics, I think, between the administrations which we have had and which in recent times, and which obviously have presided over the energy sector in the context of renewables is, and when I say renewables, I mean more recent renewables, because I suppose if we go back as far as the administration led by the Right Honourable former member for St. Thomas, the late John Michael Jeffrey Manningham Adams, affectionately known as Tom, he would have presided over the introduction of an aspect of renewable energy in Barbados, which was really the solar water heating industry. But the fact of the matter is that what I want to focus on is those things that are more recent. And one of the distinguishing characteristics differentiating administrations in more recent times is the willingness to treat this sector as a theater of opportunity. Now, ma'am, obviously there is opportunity for commercial activity, and I think that, to be fair, both administrations have recognized that that opportunity exists. It is equally a theater for investment opportunity. And again, if we are to be absolutely fair and candid, both administrations would have demonstrated to some extent an ability to grasp that reality. Where the distinction is drawn very often, ma'am, is that for this particular administration, it is also a theater of opportunity for the expansion of knowledge as a mechanism for inclusivity. And I want to start there, ma'am, because the inclusivity aspect of this new sector is a vital part of the discussion about the policies of where we're going, and it is a vital part of the bill which is going to be piloted in the House today. And equally, ma'am, this administration prides itself on the opportunity, taking the opportunity to reinvest in the national character of Barbados. And I will elaborate a little bit more on that as I go forward. But let me start with the expansion of knowledge. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, if you listen to the news as recently as this morning, you would have heard, I think it was the Chief Fire Officer, lamenting the fact that even as we speak, there is, in his judgment, the need for first responders to be better trained and to better understand the technologies which have resulted, unfortunately, in an escalating number of fires in this country. And he has mentioned among those technologies, ma'am, e-bikes and electronic cars and so on. And it goes back to the question of training, it goes back to the question of knowledge, it goes back to the question of building out a competent core of individuals who can work with these technologies and to make them as safe and as reliable for the consumer as is possible. An important part of this whole transformation of the energy sector, because you want for the equipment you use to be efficient, you want for the equipment you use, ma'am, to be safe, you want for the equipment you use, ma'am, to be, I say efficient, but to be able to satisfy standards that will be set by regulators in the most effective way as possible. And again, this particular piece of legislation takes us there when no other before has been able to do so. Now, I want to be frank with the House, as I said, ma'am. The renewable energy sector is, by definition, a technical sector. It is full of complexities. I don't think anyone would deny that. And equally, ma'am, renewable energy is, in very many cases, far too technical and complex for the average citizen easily to understand it. And when I had the privilege of being Minister of Energy, I not only understood that, but I did my best, ma'am, to reach out to the wider public of Barbados in order to not just talk the talk, but to walk the walk of expanding the knowledge base of this country with respect to renewable energy. And I did so, ma'am, because of this precise reason that I just alluded to, that we wanted as an administration to have inclusivity. Now let me be very clear with the House. We came to government, ma'am, in 2018, we came to office, and in serving the public of Barbados as we were required to do, we came to understand that there was a lot of interest in this sector, but largely by players who had the reserves of capital sitting down on, and who could be first movers and first responders because their capital, their reach financially, allowed them to be able to get technical advice when they may have had no knowledge of their own, but they could purchase it. It allowed them, ma'am, to go to the banks and so on, and even if not to the banks, independently and secure the financial advice so that they can understand the investment scenario that they will be getting their feet wet into. And ma'am, equally, they were able, because they're sitting on large pools of capital, ma'am, to start to expand the rate of investment that they have as companies, as individuals, and to penetrate a new market, ma'am, with startling and spectacular success. But where there was a challenge is recognizing that this was too few. This, ma'am, did not include anybody in Melrose, which I believe is part of the Honourable member, the Honourable Deputy Speaker of the House's constituency. It would not include anybody in Arch Hall, and that is just down the road, but in my constituency. It would not have included anybody in the Pine, ma'am, in the constituency of the Leader of Government Business. And nary a fellow in St. Lucie, ma'am, would have been included. Now there are those who have more salubrious circumstances of representation, and so you would have found some in Atlantic Shores who would have been able to have it on their roofs, in their residences, in the constituency of the Leader of the Opposition. And that perhaps is the reason why these things would not have bestirred the mind of the Leader of the Opposition, because as far as he's concerned, the people who mattered most to him were content. Though in Oistins and in Scarborough and in St. Lawrence, ma'am, you would not have found any there either. But I know that he is not as familiar with those folks as perhaps those on this side are. And if you doubt me, ma'am, history, as recently as this morning at 8 o'clock, will bear out the fact that I encountered the Leader of the Opposition lost in Valerie. I recognized the car number. I stopped. I said, "You looking for somebody or you lost?" And he conceded, ma'am, that he could not find his way out of Valerie after having gone in there early in the morning. And because I saw him bedecked in his garments for the High Court, not because I care for him that much personally, but because he was going to the High Court, I said I am going to give him guidance to help him find his way out of Valerie. And as you see, he's found himself here today, thanks to me, ma'am, because otherwise he may still be wandering around hoping to find somebody who will look favorably upon him and give him guidance. So I do not believe it is the first time that he has lost his way in the vicinity, in a district inhabited primarily by working class people. But that distance that he has from the people, the vast majority of the people in this country, sir, ma'am, is not something that we must fault him for. This is something, ma'am, that has been a weakness of his now yes, it is how he is. It is a congenital weakness. Now, ma'am, I say though that the important point of making sure that the tool of knowledge is used to build inclusivity is not something that was lost on this government. I don't want this house to be detracted by the little diversion there, because the fundamental point is that when serving as Minister of Energy in a previous iteration, ma'am, incarnation, I was able to come to this house and pilot legislation on homeowners' right to renewables, which expedited or sought to expedite the rate at which the ordinary Barbadian could access photovoltaic energy for their homes. That is a record in this house, ma'am. It had not been done before, and ma'am, it was done with a view to democratizing access to energy in Barbados so that the wealthy and the wealthy alone would not be in a position to say that they have been able to get access to a cheaper source of energy, but that we could be more inclusive and bring a democratized process in which all Barbadians, all, man, bar none, should be able to see and reap the fruits. No, ma'am, we didn't just do that. The Honourable Member for St. James South and myself would then have gone on a tour around this country, and we would have had a series of town hall meetings. Believe you me, ma'am, we would have met in parish of St. James, obviously, because we share the parish together. But equally, we would have met in St. Michael, we met in St. Peter, we met, ma'am, in St. George, we met in Christchurch. I do not recall seeing the Honourable Leader of the Opposition at the meeting in Christchurch. But we met around the island. And we did so, ma'am, we did so because we wanted to sensitize Barbadians as a whole to what was involved in this renewable energy sector. These were useful exercises, ma'am. We didn't just start on a new theater of economic activity and hope for the best, but we went out there and we brought specialists. We brought people from the renewable energy NGO, what's the word I'm looking for? Sector. We brought people, ma'am, from the banking community. We brought people, ma'am, from the Ministry of Energy. In fact, as I look across the chamber, I see one of them here now. We brought people, ma'am, from a wide cross-section of stakeholders. The insurance industry, and the Fair Trade Commission, ma'am, in order to be able to explain, not just to hear two politicians, but to hear a wide cross-section of people, explain to the average homeowner in Barbados, what is the renewable energy sector about? What is this thing called photovoltaics about? The cost may be a concern to you. How do you access these expensive pieces of technology? We talk to the bankers who are present. Insurance issues for your home, how do you deal with that? Talk to the people from the insurance sector. You want to understand now how rates are set if you're going to sell into the grid or you're going to be off-grid and you don't understand the difference, you have an opportunity to talk to the Fair Trade Commission. And on it went, ma'am, around the country in an effort, ma'am, to make sure that those people who are easily characterized as the underprivileged and the more humble folk in Barbados are able to be included in a sector that was going otherwise to be once again dominated by those who have, by the too few as opposed to the very many. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I feel strongly about this point, and I will tell you why. Because there has been a history in this country where every time we have sought to create a new artery of economic opportunity, it comes to be dominated by the same people. When sugar was king, ma'am, the complexion of those who dominated the sugar industry was lily white. And that is not to make a racial slur, that's a statement of fact. And that those who did yeoman labor in the fields were of much darker hue and complexion. Not to be a statement, ma'am, of racial tone, but that is, ma'am, a statement of fact. And then the tourism sector came in, and people said, look, this is a new opportunity of economic activity. But here they shout, who were the people who owned the hotel investments? They were of the same origin and background. And indeed, ma'am, those people who performed the more humble tasks in the tourism sector, those people who would be seen to be doing the cleaning of the rooms and preparing of food and so on and so forth, they, ma'am, were people who you will find in the humble communities of your constituency. And that the member for St. James South will find in the humble communities of her constituency. And we can't go on and on changing or creating new areas of economic activity in Barbados and not recognize that there must be at the same time a government that will say, hold, enough. Hold, enough. Enough is enough. Let us make sure now that we bring in others who can benefit. Otherwise, ma'am, there will never be a rectification of the class imbalances in this country. And so therefore we see in the renewable energy sector an area of new economic opportunity, but we say that while we welcome investment from all and sundry, we must go out of our way to be as inclusive as possible and to democratize the sector and to ensure that those people who may not be financially well off can be afforded entry in and an opportunity to participate, ma'am. Now, it is a new sector, as I say, and it is above and beyond just a matter of the philosophy of the government. As I said, I want to speak to the House in a holistic way and in a candid way, because all that the government has tried to do has not been without its challenges and its pitfalls, its successes, and, ma'am, the areas of weaknesses. And we have to look at these things through the lens, I hope, of a nationalistic perspective. Because there's one thing this government cannot be accused of, and that is not trying to make sure that this sector can deliver for the people of Barbados. Mr. Speaker, sir, Madam Deputy Speaker, ma'am, across Barbados, the Honourable Member for St. James South and myself would have met, and we would have discussed with Barbadians of all walks of life, and we would have discussed, ma'am, this relatively new frontier, this new artery of economic activity. And quite frankly, ma'am, the feedback that we got was that there was, in fact, a deficiency of understanding in some cases. And equally, from the technical people, we came to understand, ma'am, that this sector is fraught with its own challenges. Now, that is not necessarily a bad thing. It is a good thing for a minister or a team of ministers to roll up their sleeves and go out into the community and to speak to the people in the company of the technical experts and hear firsthand from the technical experts and from the people what some of the challenges are in the particular sector. And we make no apology for having done that. And in working with those people, ma'am, we understand that there were a number of uncertainties, and in fact, there were a number of pitfalls, and some still exist. And the truth is, ma'am, that for Barbados, it was a learning curve. The first Minister of Energy in this administration was the Honourable Member for Christchurch East. And when he would have come in, ma'am, there was no precedent that he could have looked across the Atlantic to find, the Caribbean Sea to find. St. Lucia had not started their renewable energy effort yet. Dominica had not started its renewable energy effort yet. St. Vincent had not started their renewable energy effort yet, ma'am. And you could go through the Eastern Caribbean chain, the archipelago, and you would have found, ma'am, that there would have been no precedent. But we know, ma'am, that bureaucracy fixates itself on routine. And all of us who have had to interface with the very able public servants of Barbados know that the first thing that the public servant will do is to go for a file and to see where this has happened before and what happened. And that is how our system has evolved. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition, like myself, is trained in the practice of law. And that is about routine, a precedent. And that you find a precedent, and that is how you go forward. Where did it happen before? What happened? How do we distinguish where we are now from what was there before? But how do we take guidance? But in this sector, ma'am, for this government, in this country, there was no precedent. So we therefore had to do that which all little babies do. You creep before you walk, and you walk before you run. And therefore, ma'am, we started from ground zero. There was, and in my judgment still is, a lot of room for us to improve and to progress. But ma'am, there's equally, in the context of a discussion like this, no time and no room for the traditional political dance of pointing fingers and looking to see what cheap political point may be made. I start there, ma'am, because I want to remind this House that every state across the world, bar none, every state across the world is retrofitting its economy in an effort to become more reliant on renewable energy and less reliant on fossil fuels. All states, ma'am, are trying now to drive their economies into the future on the basis of renewable energy technology, bar none. And therefore, Barbados, our interest must be Barbados first. Barbados must be part of this movement, and we must, ma'am, remain and seize and maintain as close to a competitive edge as is possible. It is a race, it is a race towards renewables, and we, ma'am, must be as competitive in that race as we can be. And therefore, we have to approach this sector with a certain degree of seriousness in the context of the national security significance, which I pointed out at the beginning. Now, ma'am, I had indicated that I wanted, in the course of this address, to transcend the pettiness of partisan politics. I begin by pointing out to this House that in 2013, the Freundel Stewart administration would have passed a piece of legislation which is called the Electric Light and Power Act, the ELPA. When you hear me in the course of this speech, Madam Deputy President, refer to the ELPA, I'm referring to a piece of legislation that was passed in here when you and I were sitting across there in 2013, the Electric Light and Power Act. That piece of legislation, ma'am, let us be fair to the government of the time. That is the legislation that we are now coming here to repeal and replace. And I intend to go into this in great detail. The Honourable Member on the other side is writing his notes furiously and frantically. You can take your time, son. I do not intend to hustle through this, so you will have a lot of time. I want you to pay attention not the pre-scripted notes that were put down for you that you're copying out on a paper now. I want you to pay attention so that we can engage, hopefully, sensibly, and as equals on a matter of national importance. Fundamental foundation level work, ma'am, was done with that Electric Light and Power Act. Foundation level. You can't build this edifice that we stand, this grand edifice, ma'am, has to stand on a foundation. It is a lovely piece of architecture, but it had to have a foundation. And what the government of the then Friend Stewart administration did was to provide a foundation. Ma'am, it had some benefit in that it broke a 100-year-old monopoly, which was previously held by the Barbados Light and Power, which is the utility on record in this, the public utility in this country. You may recall, ma'am, that for 100 years prior to 2013, it was completely illegal for anybody to supply electricity onto the national grid in Barbados. That you could generate electricity, but you could not supply it onto this country's grid. That electric power, that ELPA, Electric Light and Power Act, was able to facilitate the supply onto the grid, ma'am, by new players. So that's the second good thing that came out of the act, that in breaking the monopoly, it enabled, in theory, the commercial entry into a marketplace of new players, ma'am, who would be able, for the first time, to sell electricity onto the grid. Now, I say in theory, because in fact, in actual fact, while I am sure the government of the day meant well, while I believe they would have meant well, ma'am, the theory was fatally flawed because of the fact that there was a context in which it operated that the government of the day seemed to be painfully unaware of or disinterested in. And that context, ma'am, was that there was no connection with the broad-based need for, or the need for broad-based national buy-in and genuine democratization of the sector. That is the point that I began on when I talk about this administration seeing as part of the several areas of opportunity, the opportunity to educate the people of Barbados in their broad masses, ma'am, so that they would be in a position to be not just casual bystanders, not strangers in their own land, not tenants watching development take place, but be party to the progress that's happening in the country and being participants in a new area of economic activity. Now, ma'am, due to the limited knowledge base of that wider Barbadian public, and you would have heard what I said just now, I can say with confidence that there was a limited knowledge base because I was the person, along with the minister with me at the time, the Honourable Member for St. James South, who would have gone out there and done the series of public meetings across Barbados. And therefore, ma'am, we knew that there would have been challenges that many people would have been able to identify to us. Now, for example, you go into a public meeting of that nature, a town hall, and you realize that the average householder, ma'am, tells you straight up, I am not an engineer. The average householder comes and says, Minister, I'm glad that you have this town hall meeting. I am not an engineer, but I have an interest in this. I hear that this could work to bring down my bills, the cost of my electricity. The average small business person would have come and said to us, they're not electrical professionals, but they have an interest in understanding the difference between grid-connected PV and off-grid connected PV. PV meaning photovoltaics, Madam Deputy Speaker. So some can be connected to the grid, and that's a different arrangement, and some are off-grid. And what is the distinction between the two? People ask those questions. And the average business person, ma'am, equally was mindful of the fact that they may, for example, I recall well, there was a gentleman who had a mini-mart, and he put photovoltaics on the roof of the mini-mart. And ma'am, the grid. He then connected the PV system to the grid. Surprise of surprises, this was done at the same time that there would have been a raise in fuel prices in this country. And he could not understand why having put on the PV and selling the electricity into the grid and buying back from the Light and Power, he is seeing an increase in price. Not understanding that the fuel adjustment clause is at the basis of that increase, because the fuel adjustment clause, ma'am, is reflecting the increase in the petrol price, the cost of petroleum product that we are bringing into Barbados. No, ma'am, those are technical difficulties that people did not get and did not understand. And part of what we had to do was to try to enhance the knowledge base of the country and to give people an opportunity that these esoteric, these things which are difficult for the uninitiated and the underexposed to understand, that they would be able, ma'am, to be able to better relate to. Now, I say that, again, the absence of knowledge, perhaps, was not limited only to the consumers or to the investor. And that is the difficulty that this administration has had to grapple with. Because the absence of knowledge is not to say that the people are ignorant. We are saying, ma'am, that people were underexposed because this is a brand new sector, and it is a technical sector, and it is rife with complexities. And ma'am, therefore, even the regulator, let us be candid, not just the economic regulator, but even government's regulator, the government electrical engineering department, had to come to terms with the new requirements and new expectations under this renewable energy, or created by this new renewable energy sector. I have to be candid with you, ma'am. It was new for the town planning department. It was new for government electrical engineering. It obviously, ma'am, would have been new for the Fair Trade Commission. It equally, ma'am, don't mind that they're the utility, it's new for the utility too. And there are a number of things, ma'am, which reflected themselves in the old administration, which we repeal and replace today. And I say this because I am trying my best, ma'am, to walk the Parliament through the challenges that have had to be confronted and overcome. These are not challenges that are going to be found in the WhatsApp commentary being sent to the leader of the opposition. These are not challenges, ma'am, that are scripted, prescripted responses, and this is not intended to be a debate where we come in here to attack. This is a debate where I hope we come in here to engage. And the fact of the matter is, ma'am, that when we came to the point where we recognized that licenses are being issued, but there were some transmission, some feeder lines, a line, ma'am, that is transmitting electricity to a part of Barbados. They call it a feeder line. But some feeder lines, ma'am, are overly licensed. And that can have a technical problem being created, because unless you have renewable energy supported by battery storage, then, ma'am, you have too much built onto the line, and it cannot supply well, let's put it this way. As I speak, the sun's shining, and all the photovoltaic panels feeding electricity onto the grid. Try anything. But, ma'am, the reality is that unless you can store some of it, if you keep on packing on onto that line, the line can't carry it all, so therefore you get meltdown. And at that point, putting it very crudely, the line becomes useless. So therefore, the dissonance, the lack of relationship between that physical reality and where the regulator was at, the economic regulator, and saying to the minister, and the minister is not supposed to be an energy expert, the minister is supposed to take advice. The economic regulator is not saying to the minister, well, you know, minister, in Green Hill, in the constituency of the Prime Minister, There is a feeder line that is at the uttermost limit of its capacity. What is being said is, let us put more energy onto the feeder line. There the shout no. Some technical expert says, but this ain't making sense because you can't keep putting it on there unless you have storage. But then you go back to the Electric Light and Power Act passed by the From the Store administration, and the word storage does not appear in the legislation. So that even as new legislation was passed in Barbados to accommodate a renewable energy sector, ma'am, the fundamental of storing electricity and then selling it into the grid when needed, not oversupply, but when needed, so that I can produce today and produce tomorrow and sell into the grid next week. Ma'am, that was not contemplated in the legislation at all. And so therefore, people are going merrily along the road. Geography of allocating licenses was not thought of. And therefore, in Arch Hall, in my constituency, in Green Hill, in the constituency of the Prime Minister, and in a few others, ma'am, which are populated by high-density commercial activity of one kind or another, ma'am, you had a problem where you were having oversupply and the danger, therefore, of complete breakdown and grid malfunction. At that point, ma'am, when you go to the legislation to find the solutions, you find an absence, a dearth, a complete absence of anything that speaks to these issues, because the legislation passed in 2013, amended by the same Democratic Labour Party in 2015, ma'am, was not able to speak to that. Now, again, I say, I want to be fair, because the government of that time did a wonderful thing in having a foundational step of taking out of the hands of a 100-year-old monopoly complete control over the generation and the dispatch and the transmission of electricity in Barbados. But, ma'am, certain questions have to arise as you embark on a new sector. The sector has to be properly governed. And while you may have a regulator who was innocent of knowledge on some of these things, equally, ma'am, you can't have a utility that is a partner. And the spirit of the structure that we have, is that the utility is effectively a partner. In the new sector's market structure, the utility can generate its own electricity. The utility is entitled to store its own electricity. And the utility can take from itself that which it has generated and which it has stored. And at the same time, you, Madam Deputy Speaker, are a player in the sector, because you are entitled to generate your own electricity, and you're entitled to store your own electricity, and you expect the utility to buy it from you. So there has to be an issue of how this is going to be governed, because if the utility wanted to be rapacious, and we know, I will not say that they are or were or are interested in being rapacious, I will simply say that there's a history about monopolies, especially monopolies that have been around for 100 years. It is very difficult to leave the monopolistic tendency behind. It becomes an instinct. So the law may change, but your thought process about the market you're in often remains the same. The new environment is like the hand of Esau, but the voice continues to be the voice of Jacob. And therefore, ma'am, what you have is a situation where you have to have now a piece of legislation that allows for and ensures an appropriate type of governance that will make sure that the market is monitored properly and that the utility has to discharge certain requirements in law, and that the role of the utility in the administration of the grid becomes transparent. And why must it be transparent, ma'am? Because there must be fairness. And why must there be fairness, ma'am? I borrow the words of the Leader of the Opposition. Because there must be justice. There must be justice. And that is what I mean by democratizing this sector. But the legislation which we come here to repeal and replace today, ma'am, has not been a piece of legislation which was conducive to that. I also say, ma'am, that the investment in the national character, in this country's character, is an important part of this conversation. I want to have that early. Because, ma'am, reinvestment in the national character enables us to have a holistic approach to the way in which we build out, assign responsibilities, discharge responsibilities in a sector that is of inestimable value to Barbados. I want to emphasize as I go there, I want to emphasize, ma'am, that I have a position that says that it is highly desirable, it is extremely desirable that there be a role to be played by private citizens in this process. I feel that I should, from this place, urge that there continue to be a role to be played by private citizens, ma'am, because it is useful, as I said, from my own experience. I don't know that I should speak on this floor on behalf of the Honourable Member for St. James South, but I know it was her experience with me that there was constructive engagement when we engage with the communities of Barbados. And there is room for purposeful and responsible engagement. And we can only have that, ma'am, if as a government we do that which we did. You have to welcome the voices of the public in support. And you have to be prepared, much as we do month after month after month, when the Prime Minister will have an unfiltered sit-down with every parish in succession in this country. You let 1,000 thoughts contend, you hear 1,000 voices, and that is the constructive engagement that we do as we try, ma'am, to amplify the level of democracy in Barbados. The country, however, becomes ill-served and underserved. I say again, the country becomes ill-served and underserved when, instead of constructive engagement, unbridled sense of ego, an unbridled sense of ego, ma'am, allows individual contribution to become a contributor to what is a toxic environment. It is harmful and it is unhelpful. Now, ma'am, it is beyond my comprehension how one Minister of Energy in Barbados, one Minister of Energy, can receive from one objector, one intervener, ma'am, objection after objection, intervention after intervention after intervention, on virtually every single policy initiative announced or proposed by the government or by the minister. It then, ma'am, asks us whether the character of the nation's effort to democratize this sector, to make the sector answerable and responsive to all interests, whether, ma'am, the effort is falling on infertile soil. And, ma'am, it is a very serious thing. You receive an objection, ma'am, for things that seem to be outlandish. An objection that the Light and Power's application for the utility to retain its licenses to transmit and dispatch electricity not be given. Where does that take us? And therefore, ma'am, there's a need for us to be able, in my judgment, to ensure that as we go forward, we have a sector which is responsive to public interests, but in a manner, ma'am, which, as I said, is constructive and reflective of ideas that provide a pathway for progress as opposed to obstruction for the sake of obstruction. I feel, ma'am, that it is necessary to speak to this House, frankly, also about the wider context of the national energy policy, because that explains why there has been such a level of urgency on the part of government. I have heard the criticism, and I think the criticism is rooted in a misunderstanding of what government's ambitions are. As I said to you, all countries on planet Earth are now embarked on this journey towards placing their economies on a renewable energy footing. All countries. We have to be competitive, ma'am. And therefore, we can't afford to be the slouches. Having been off to a fast start in the Caribbean, we can't afford now to be the slouches and fall to the back of the pack. But above and beyond where we want to go, in terms of the renewable energy commitment, there is a rationale of why we have to stop relying on fossil fuels. And if I'm to speak frankly to the House, ma'am, the first part of the rationale turns on the question of the fuel import bill. And let us not fool ourselves into believing that we can forever be in a situation where we are held hostage to activities that are taking place 100,000 kilometers from here. Last weekend saw an escalation of warfare in the Middle East. A few days ago, an escalation of warfare in the Middle East. Look at what happens with the petrol prices every time that happens. And ma'am, the truth of the matter is that our fuel import bill will hover on average from year to year somewhere around $250, $300 million. Whenever you have had the type of escalation that we have seen a couple days ago, on which, quite frankly, we experienced also with the war in the Ukraine, you see that $300 million figure goes to $5 million, $6 million. And in 2023, ma'am, it went as high as $7.8 million. But that, for the Minister of Finance, is a headache. Because effectively, you are saying now that that is 3 times more you got to spend on the essential of fuel import for Barbados, so as to keep buses running, so as to keep the hospital functioning, so as to make sure the water authority can pump water. And at the same time, ma'am, we know that there are fundamentals of life that we must be able to finance, such as being able to make sure that poor people in your constituency, ma'am, and in mine, are able to get house repairs done. Roads can be fixed. Now, therefore, Madam Speaker, the fuel import bill is one issue. The other issue, ma'am, is that we have to invest in opportunities for our young people. And in every aspect of this renewable energy sector, there's an opportunity for young people to be able to earn a living in a way in which they were not able to do before, and in a way in which, ma'am, none of us who are sitting in this parliament could have done while we were in our 20s and early 30s. So that, ma'am, it is an investment in the skills, in new skills. It is an investment in employment opportunity. And may I say, it is an investment in foreign exchange earning opportunity, because let us never lose sight of the fact that as difficult as things may be from time to time in Barbados, we are ahead of the Eastern Caribbean in this renewable energy endeavor. And there are already Barbadians who are working overseas in other Caribbean countries, helping to bring them up to speed and helping to earn foreign exchange for themselves over there. So it is gainful employment, ma'am. It is an opportunity to earn rather than to spend foreign exchange. And then equally, ma'am, there's the question of us bringing to a halt this crippling culture of complacency in Barbados, which allows us to criticize a prime minister who is trying to urge us to have pace and to go further, faster, and be better. So we criticize that, while there is $1 billion, with a B, $1 billion tied up in investments in banks in Barbados, waiting to be unleashed in renewable energy endeavor and in renewable energy investment, but it cannot be unleashed because the system is clogged by either bad planning on the part of the utility, challenges in overcoming the challenges of the Fair Trade Commission, or some other technical issue. So that, ma'am, in response, we are often told that we have the deepest PV penetration in the Caribbean, And I want to urge the House that while that may be true, we cannot remove from ourselves the responsibility, ma'am, to strive for excellence. Now, as I said, this world is not going to wait on us. And this sector becomes vitally important if we are to be competitive. And I'm going to say a word thing or two about the level of competition. You know, Brazil moved to biofuels 50 years ago. 50 years ago, Madam Deputy Speaker, Brazil moved its economy to place it on a biofuels footing. And today's Brazil sees 90% of its grid as being RE. So if we are serious about ourselves, we have to ask ourselves, can we be content to say that we have the highest rate of PV penetration in the Caribbean and that's well enough? Or do we want to be like a Brazil where 90% of the grid is renewable energy? It's a question of how you see yourself. I think there was a Prime Minister who asked at one point, what mirror image do you have of yourself? Global investment, for example, in wind energy has trebled over the course of the last 5 years. Barbados has 1 megawatt of wind energy. The need exists for us to strive, ma'am, for climate positive growth. And we believe as a government that this is possible. But we have to ask ourselves whether we are fit for purpose. And I want to submit to this House, ma'am, that this piece of legislation enables us to get onto a footing that enables us to be fit for purpose. That is what this bill is about. Now, if I was to turn to the legislation, I am going to be looking at its strengths. It offers Barbados, ma'am, a new paradigm with respect to treating to regulatory capacity. I have said in the course of the last hour or so that I've been speaking, that the regulator is a critical component of this matrix. There has to be economic regulation, setting of tariffs, etc., making sure that the consumer is not overcharged, making sure that there's a return on investment for the person who's making the investment. But equally, ma'am, there has to be standards of service. We know that there must be standards of service because we've experienced the agony of knowing that the grid shut down for a whole day. I believe that was one of the challenges that was experienced when the Honourable Member for Christchurch East would have been Minister. We have heard the painful and pathetic excuses about, oh, a monkey get caught in something or the other. So the country is bereft of electricity. Operating theatre at QEH can't work, plane can't land, and so on and so forth. No, ma'am, we can't go on that way. And as we enter into this new paradigm of operations, the inexperience of the regulator, as I said, and the underexposure of the regulator to this new environment has become clear. So you have to solve that problem. There's only one really way of solving it. You have to bring in skills so as to upskill the regulatory capacity of the country and to strengthen the regulatory capacity of the country. Otherwise, ma'am, we have regulatory lag that we cannot match the pace of expression of interest from ordinary householders all the way back up to those who want to spend $10 or $15 million in an investment. We can't match that with the pace and the capacity that the regulatory agencies can work at. Now, ma'am, as you look at the way in which the previous act is operated, or the current act, because we've not yet replaced it, you realize that decisions are being made of an administrative nature, but then, as will always happen from time to time, I get a decision made against me and I don't like the decision. But it is my right in law, or should be, that I can have a review of that. The legislation, ma'am, is ineffective. It is weak in terms of review processes. That is not good enough. There must be a right of decision of a citizen to have a review of decisions, and that has to be strengthened, and it is now strengthened in the legislation. Ma'am, the limited coordination between, or I prefer to say the discohesion between the regulatory agencies the licensing authority itself, the utility, and the policymaker is something that I would have alluded to a little while ago. There has to be, ma'am, in every, especially in the larger scale investments, there is an inevitable interaction between the Ministry of Energy, where the policy making, machinery, and power resides. But there's also an interaction, ma'am, with the Fair Trade Commission, because they are the economic and standards of service regulator. And of course, ma'am, the government has its technical advisors, which is the Government Electrical Engineering Department. And therefore, there must be created, these are all stakeholders, but there must be in the legislation clearly defined roles of responsibility, clearly demarcated areas of accountability and responsibility, which manage the interaction between the policymaker on one hand, the service standards of service regulator on the other, and government's technical advisors, ma'am. And that legislation passed in 2013 and amended in 2015, virtually silent on it. And so therefore, you cannot have certainty in law. And this is the point, that you ask why things then become difficult to advance. Because the Ministry of Energy lays claim, and rightfully so, over a decision that has to be made. But then you have, equally, the Government Electrical Engineering Department saying, but yes, I hear what y'all saying, but this is my own view. And I may have left out the town planning. But the town planning very often has to be part of this process as well, especially when you're talking about large-scale investments, ma'am, like those found in the agriculture sector, which, because photovoltaic, as we've seen in the agriculture sector, is land-hungry. So you would have large acreages of space taken up. And so therefore, the ability to correlate between all these different departments of government in a sensible and cohesive way has to be made right. And it is not in the existing legislation, ma'am, and it is something that we have to fix and now seek to do. Equally, ma'am, the delineation, as I said, between the roles being played by stakeholders is one thing. But the stakeholders must then interface with new entrants. And many times there are new entrants, ma'am, who make their investment or go to the bank and secure a loan and begin, ma'am, to pay interest on that loan, only to be told by the stakeholders, well, you know, you have a problem that we didn't draw to your attention earlier on. So then they are on pause. And while the stakeholders are working out what they're going to do, the loan commitment still running. But I have borrowed money. I may have borrowed on a large-scale investment. I may have committed $5 million. And I am paying interest on that $5 million every month that I got to face the bank on. But every month, while the clock is ticking, I am still frantically trying to get out of the Ministry of Energy or out of the town planning department or out of the FTC or wherever the blockage lies, the solution to the problem that enables me to see a return on my investment or some movement on the investment that I have made. And if we don't do that, then, man, we have frustrated the investment and laid waste to the effort of having that money being loaned. In fact, the loan may fail. Worse yet. So effectively, the failure in the system can lead to the virtual bankruptcy of the individual who is making the investment. That is a foolishness. That is a foolishness. And because of the inappropriate legislative environment within which we were functioning, ma'am, on more than a few occasions, we have found that these are challenges that have arisen, and they must be faced and confronted and wrestled to the ground. The new environment does not admit easily of inexpensive investments. If we want to have scale, and renewable energy does require significant scale of investment, it may not be in the PV, it might be in wind, it might be in whatever, but the technologies are not inexpensive. And if you want it at large scale, it becomes more expensive. And therefore, ma'am, there must be a synergy. You cannot continue a situation where you have money stalled in the banks, but investors anxious to be able to spend, banks willing to lend, but the bureaucracy of the government is a source of frustration. I said I wanted to be candid with this House. And these are challenges which have arisen in practice. I say in the beginning, in theory, the first piece of legislation, that ELPA, was aimed at doing something good. I have no doubt about that. But its capacity to deliver in the context of the real world, ma'am, is sorely lacking. Now, the ELPA does not ensure equally the ability of the power system to provide end users with a secure and uninterrupted supply of electricity with generation adequacy or operational security. There has to be, ma'am, a satisfactory balance of requirements, balance of relationship between those people who are going to be the consumer in the end of the day, that they can know that they're going to have a secure and uninterrupted supply and adequate generation, ma'am. And the original piece of legislation did not satisfactorily do that either. The other thing that we had to be concerned about is that the state or departments of the government, let's put it that way, different departments of the government, cannot each be entitled to their own regime. And we had this idealistic thing, which we did, well-intentioned again. We wanted to have PV on government buildings. And we placed PV on several government buildings. It is a well-intentioned endeavor. It helps bring down government's elite bill. Added to doing that, of course, equally, ma'am, we should also maintain, not just have, but we must have and maintain an ongoing conversation with the occupants of government buildings, whether they be offices or wherever, because, ma'am, far too often what you see is that people leave a government office and the air conditioning turn off. Or you leave an office at night and the lights on. And you go back there at 8 or 9 o'clock, you forget something, and you find that everything on in the office, nothing was turned off. Because government got money and the body and got to turn off the light. That is the culture of complacency and contentment that we have to battle with. But ma'am, the substantive point is that because the ELPA did not bind the Crown, but then the Crown bind the state now, you have a different regime for government departments. And you can't have a regime for government departments and a regime for the ordinary citizens and the two conflicting with one another. So that government departments consider themselves not to be bound by the same rules that everybody else is bound by. But that can't work. And therefore, when the regulator steps in, or when the Ministry of Energy says no, then there's a challenge and a clash because we are not bound in law. So the legislation itself has to be certain. And as the Honourable Leader of the Opposition knows, if there's uncertainty in the legislation, there's imperfection in the legislation, and there's a duty of the government to correct that. Now, Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, the requirement for licensing renewable energy systems at 5 kilowatts or under was also a problem. That was not contemplated when the ELPA was crafted in 2013. As I've said in this House today, it was this government that came here with a householder's right to renewable energy policy. And in that householder's right to renewable energy, we wanted, as I indicated previously, to ensure that ordinary persons could be pushed into the queue and given an opportunity to source renewable energy, and that it not all be captured by those people who have large pockets. There are some very competent and capable and successful, intuitive business people in Barbados. One in particular comes to mind, who would on a Sunday evening be seen driving around Barbados, looking at buildings which are of sufficient size that he could have a chat with the landlord or the owner and say, look, your roof is suitable for PV investment. Join me in a partnership. I will put onto your roof how much ever megawatts, of power, and what we will do is to have a split of the profits. It worked for him because he's able to make the investment. It works for the country because the country will get some. But, ma'am, the truth is that you cannot continue to fill all of the feeder lines only by investments which come from the well-to-do. Otherwise, we go back to the argument I made before. We would be excluding a wide cross-section of ordinary Barbadians who will then be bystanders, standing, watching the streets of Rome while noble Caesar paraded through in his chariot of gold. Can't work. And so therefore, we want people to be included, and you can't just say it, you have to act it. So we came here and we did the Householders' Right to Renewable Energy legislation. But, ma'am, the truth is that you can't equally make what is a simple act unduly burdensome. The systems of 5 kilowatts to 10 kilowatts, under 5 kilowatts up to 10 kilowatts, ma'am, present minimal challenge, minimal risk to the reliability of the grid. They present minimal risk to the integrity of the grid. And that's a fact. And so therefore, it does not make a lot of sense to ask persons who just want to put a little 5 kilowatt thing on the rooftop to look after the family and keep the refrigeration bill down and the couple lights on in the house, the bill come down, to have to stand in line waiting on a license and the formalities of all of that. So the legislation seeks to expedite that, to make it easier. It is effectively ease of doing business. And again, let me say to this House, for too long, Barbados has talked about ease of doing business in the context of the wealthy, whether they be foreign investors or wealthy local investors, coming here or existing here, and how best we facilitate people who want to plow $1 million or $5 or $15 or $20 million or more into an investment in Barbados. And you hear, oh, the ease of doing business is important, business facilitation is critical. I want to say, ma'am, that every person who is involved in commercial activity is a business person. Some may or may not see themselves that way, but they should. And that the ease of doing business must apply to them as well. And therefore, ma'am, when we say that a small shopkeeper should be able to put 5 kilowatts on her roof, and that should be simply an administrative matter so that you simply register the fact that you're placing this with the Ministry of Energy so the Ministry of Energy knows that this is a source of electricity, that if they care to, they can send out and have an audit or an inspection done, that it is properly set up, and if it is connected to the grid, that is being done properly, then, ma'am, that is where the bureaucracy should end. But to ask these people now to wait 3 or 4 months on a license where everybody else is doing at much larger scale does not make a lot of sense. It stands in the way of ease of doing business, especially for small investments which are presenting minimal risk to the integrity or the reliability of the grid. The other concern that we had, ma'am, was that the ELPA does not or did not require licensees to seek permission for a change of ownership of the license. And this is a practical matter, again, that raised its head as we saw the licenses unfold. Because, ma'am, you know, people will make an investment, but in the back part of their mind, they're not interested in the same thing, perhaps, that government is interested in. I listed a number of things. We want to bring down the foreign exchange costs for the fuel import bill. We want to make sure that we got young people trained in a new sector that could be going to work, etc. The average person ain't interested in that so much. At election time, that makes for a good conversation. But in my day-to-day business experience, I'm interested in profit. I didn't open my business for the government to tell me about foreign exchange. I opened my business to get a profit. And part of what we have seen evolve, ma'am, is that due diligence is part of the licensing process. So the committee created under the ELPA, the advisory committee, conducts capacity checks, financial capacity checks. It conducts its due diligence. It does its due diligence exercises on the people who are making an application to be able to invest in the sector. And then, ma'am, it issue a license. Here they shout. Along comes somebody and says, Honourable Member for St. George South, I gather that you're holding a license that will enable 1 megawatt of electrical generation by PV. I want to take that over from you. And the Honourable Member for St. George South says, well, boy, it's gonna cost you a penny. He says, tell me how much. And therefore, for 3 times what the value of the license is, he can sell the license. He gone laughing to the bank, but then the state is exposed. The state, Madam Deputy Speaker, is exposed because the due diligence and financial capacity checks were done against the Honourable Member for St. George South. But the new body who come on it may or may not be able to sustain the investment that they have. They may or may not be able to maintain it appropriately. They may or may not be able to meet the standard of service required by the Fair Trade Commission. And therefore, ma'am, what has happened behind the back of the ministry, outside of this purview and the scope and the vision of the regulator, is a financial transaction that works for 2 people or 2 parties, but that can expose the grid to a question of integrity risk and instability. We can't have that. And again, ma'am, as I say to you, there must be in this process candor. There must be in this process an opportunity for the 1,000 thoughts to contend and 1,000 voices to be heard. And we see it as a theater of opportunity for people to have commercial investments. We see it as a theater of opportunity for people to make investment. But ma'am, equally there have to be guardrails established to ensure that the greater good, which is the safety and the integrity of the national grid, is protected. And the stability of that grid. And if you see it through the lens of the nation's concern, that's why I talk about the national character, Madam Deputy Speaker. The national character. Because if you get 15 people who are doing large-scale investments, 10 megawatts or more, and those 15 people, ma'am, are able to procure their licenses by way of a sale outside of the scope and scrutiny of the Ministry of Energy, then, ma'am, what you have is a massive amount of electrical generation which is taking place outside of the regulator's knowledge. And maybe not outside the regulator's knowledge, but outside of the regulator's capacity to superintend. And that is where the risk comes about. So that all of the due diligence done before granting the license, and I've seen how they operate with some of the larger investments. Does this person have the capacity to sustain this? Is it likely that this is going to be able to be maintained? I can come to the battery storage that should be associated with it and the cost of the storage. And then, ma'am, lo and behold, it falls into the hands of somebody who thought that they could, but actually cannot. And then what happens? So these are the considerations, ma'am, that had to be looked at, and that the new legislation which we seek to repeal and replace will speak to. As I indicated before, ma'am, there is an anomaly in the ELPA where a licensee is expected to negotiate a rate for its power purchase agreement with the utility. But he is also in direct competition with the same utility for generating capacity. So I am going to generate, and I have to negotiate a rate at which the utility can buy this electricity from me. But the utility is in the business of generating too. And I am a weaker partner in the process because the utility don't just generate, the utility also has the power, the sole power, to transmit and dispatch. So there is an unevenness and an inequality in the structure of the market. And the reason why I speak to the House in this way, ma'am, is because the very glib and trite approach that we have traditionally taken to many sectors in Barbados ought not, and in my respectful submission, ma'am, must not apply to this. It is far too fundamental, and quite frankly, it is far too technical. And we have to find a way of making this sector work in the interest of all, not just the investors, not just the utility, not just the stakeholders, but, ma'am, also the consumers and the state generally. And therefore, ma'am, it is necessary for us to have done what we did, to pick apart that legislation, which we today seek to repeal and replace, and to answer some of the weaknesses that it has demonstrated in a way that allows for Barbados then to be able to say and feel a sense of satisfaction as we go forward. The ELPA equally, ma'am, did not address essentials of the new market structure. Now, it is impossible, ma'am, for me to accept that this was not a fatal flaw. I have been fair. I said of the last administration that they did a wonderful thing in breaking the monopoly. It is my judgment, however, that even as you break the monopoly, foresight, reasonable foresight, it is a doctrine known to law. Reasonable foresight should have allowed that the administration of the day would have realized some of the things that I have just spoken to, which reflect the broad character of the new market, which is being liberalized. A marketplace in which a utility is the only public utility, the only one. And you say to that utility, gentlemen, you are going to be enabled to continue to generate your own electricity. Well, that is a gift. Especially if I am going to still be able, especially if I'm still going to be able to dispatch, and especially if I'm still going to be able to transmit. And the difference between the dispatch and the transmitting, I perhaps should make clear to the House, because generally you're transmitting it all around the island, but there may be a time where you have to take a chunk of the power and send it to some specific location, and that is where the dispatching comes about. And ma'am, what we have done is to give the utility the wide gamut of opportunity. And at the same time, this utility is going to purchase from its competitors. You understand what I'm telling you, Madam Deputy Speaker? From its competitors. People who are saying, I have a license now to produce too, and I want you to buy it from me. Now tell me, the natural human instinct is to say, well, boy, I could buy, but I also could buy for myself. I selling, I could buy for myself. So you are disadvantaged against me. And therefore I can unfair you. Let me put it in very simple Barbadian terms. I can unfair you. And therefore, the weakness in the pre-existing legislation or currently existing legislation is that there needed, ma'am, to be a way in which you monitor this market and that you plan out the system as you go forward. You know, one of the biggest secrets in Barbados is how the grid functions. One of the biggest secrets in Barbados, sir, is how the electrical grid in Barbados is maintained, what money is put into to maintenance and new technology and so on in the grid. And even the Ministry of Energy cannot tell you with absolute certainty what is the level of commitment of reinvestment that is made into the grid on a month-by-month and year-by-year basis. But we can't have that. And we know that the system must be planned out because the country is planned out. We know the system must satisfy a level of demand for electricity in new districts because we know that in every parish of Barbados, there are new districts. We know that the electrical system of Barbados must answer adequately the call for all of the houses which are being brought on stream by the member for St. George South as Minister of Housing. When there was nothing but green grass growing before, there are now houses being built. So therefore, like in Bullins in my constituency, which was previously an agriculture station, only plants growing there. Now they got, 40-odd houses there. Madam Deputy Speaker, the electrical grid must satisfy them. You go a little further down in Lancaster, in my constituency, where there was nothing but green grass. And now you've got 300-odd houses there. The electrical grid, 150, sorry. Electrical grid must satisfy them. I want 300, well, it's only 150. But the fact of the matter is, Madam Deputy Speaker, there is a need then also to satisfy the commercial developments. Because if you drive along the South Coast, you will see a 8-story hotel being constructed as we speak. It isn't a wish. It is a reality. The honourable member who represents just up the road in Christchurch no longer takes that because the shadow of the government's success disturbs him. Driving past the shadow of the government's success. But ma'am, that hotel must be serviced with electricity and every other new investment coming on stream. And so therefore the planned expansion of the grid is something that we have to be able to ensure is done. And the system planning is part of it. The grid planning and the grid management is part of what this new act is going to be talking about. New and evolving technologies, ma'am, which speaks to a future of Barbados. And I'm going to come to that in the course of this presentation. Because, ma'am, when we understand where the world is going, we understand that there are new technologies that are constantly coming on stream. And we have to be able to prepare for a future which allows for our people to be competitive and that their creativity is unleashed, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, why must the creativity be unleashed? Because the creativity of the Barbadian people is inextricably linked. It is linked to their investments. It is linked to their employment opportunity. It is linked, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the competitiveness of the country. So you can't have an act which should be shaping and directing the future of Barbados in an area as fundamental and critical as the electricity and energy sector, and not speak, ma'am, to technologies which are nascent and coming on stream, newborn, coming on stream. But no, Barbados ain't gonna deal with that. And for too many times, I say candidly, I want to talk candidly to the House, too many times, in my experience, I have come across that approach. I remember when, as a young Minister of Tourism, newly minted, I raised the issue of drones. Drones, and the use of drones for commercial purposes. Because I read in, and I realized that you could take drones in the United States of America and move medical equipment. You could take drones in the United States and move pharmaceutical product, medicine, from a pharmacy to somebody's house. And I said, but if that's what the world is doing, why do we not position ourselves? And you know, I was told, Minister, we small. We ain't ready for that so yet. But this is precisely what the problem is. Madam Deputy Speaker, that is precisely what the problem is. It is how we see ourselves. As a previous Prime Minister said, the mirror image that we have of ourselves. It is precisely because we are small that we must be more efficient. Because that is how we compete. And that is how we pay the bills. And Madam Deputy Speaker, therefore, when the piece of legislation as critical as this is silent on the way in which we can chart a course for the future, then that piece of legislation is of little assistance and it falls into obsolescence. I want to speak also, ma'am, to the 2013 Act in the context of what existed then, but what was not spoken to with any sense of seriousness. In fact, if you pick up the 2013 Act that we repeal and replace today, you will not find the word electricity storage. You will not find the word storage. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have been fair. I have indicated the benefit of that legislation. But I must equally speak to the weaknesses. Because as I indicated to the House earlier, we cannot just be generating PV on a bright sunny day like today and not be prepared to recognize that you can't throw all of it onto the grid now because it's not being consumed. When nobody home at you ain't burning any light, Madam Deputy Speaker, there ain't nobody burning any light in any of our houses. There will be light being burned tonight at 8 o'clock when everybody home watching TV. So therefore, ma'am, you want to be able to store and then procure that when you need it. But that the 2013 Act did not make any framework legislatively for the storage of electricity in Barbados. Did not. And therefore, you can't go forward. So all the investment that we have here now, $1 billion in investment sitting down in banks, is stalled because the batteries that you have to procure in order to store electricity in Barbados, generated electricity in Barbados, are not on the island. And that's why I say that part of the weakness is also, if you're going to be absolutely candid, that the red flag needed not only to be raised when you have oversupply onto a transmission line, but the red flag needed to be raised when you say, look, but there's not any storage capacity, so as a utility, I got to make sure that I get behind the government to get in the storage capacity. And the debate that we have had in this country, and not only had, I've been privy to several meetings where the head of government, because the head of the government of Barbados cannot be the body who bringing in the storage. But the head of the government of Barbados is working behind the scenes to try to get the lighting power to realize the urgency of the hour. Because in the mind of the utility, this is business as usual. We will get there. But the point is that you can't get there down the road. You got to get there now. Because the investments are sitting in the bank now. And people are losing money now. And people are lining up to make more investment now. And the reputational stain on the country is being had now. And the consequences of it will be felt now. And the movement away from Barbados will be now. And the lack of employment opportunity will be now. That's what the problem is. It is how we see ourselves and how we can galvanize. I spoke about the national character. That is why I do not treat this debate in the context of the partisan political. Because the national character is what is at stake here, Madam Deputy Speaker. That the consequences that we are facing because of complacent attitude, a small dereliction of duty here and there, a lack of initiative here and there, it all adds up. It all adds up. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want also to speak to the broader purpose of the electricity bill, which is the regulation of generation. And but this new act speaks specifically to the following: regulation of generation, storage, transmission, distribution, dispatch, supply, and sale of electricity. So it is holistic in all of the ways in which electricity can be treated. It is a piece of legislation, this new bill, that sets out the roles and responsibilities of all the key stakeholders. I have indicated before how we have had an absence of synergy between the stakeholders, ma'am, and I do not intend to repeat myself there. What it also does, and is fundamental, is that it retains the Electricity Advisory Committee. Now, what is the role of this committee? This committee, ma'am, is to advise the minister, but it also approves the assignment of licenses. So if you have a license and you want to assign it, it has to be approved. It also, ma'am, approves the assignment of rights under the license so that the commercial transactions behind the back of the government and behind the back of the economic regulator and behind the back, ma'am, of service standards oversight that I referred to earlier cannot now take place, and it makes recommendations to the minister with respect to the issuance and renewal of licenses. So it has strengthened the hand of the Electricity Advisory Committee, ma'am, and I think that that is a wonderful and good thing because it enables the legislation to work more efficiently and more effectively in the manner in which it is intended. Now, having said that, we also have an expanded licensing regime. Clearly, we should be able to understand that we have an expanded licensing regime because before we were only talking about licensing the generation of electricity. Now we are licensing storage of electricity as well. So the regime has expanded. And it continues to expand, ma'am, if you look at what the future holds. I spoke just now to the question of evolving technologies. There are some parts of the world, ma'am, if you go to Florida, the United States, if you go to New York in the United States, you will see, and that's part of the problem, that too many of us go abroad and we do not use it as an educational journey. We see it more as a shopping trip. The fact of the matter is, ma'am, that the facilitation of areas of economic activity, there's a lot to be learned from in the external world. There are systems which, how best do I describe it? Within a given geographical space, there are private systems which enable the generation of electricity and the sale of electricity. So if you, for argument's sake, Madam Deputy Speaker, think of this House as a district, and every member is an individual home, then, ma'am, you could be generating and you could be selling to the leader of the opposition who is buying from you as opposed to taking it off the grid. And you could be selling to the honourable member for St. George South, and he buying from you as opposed to taking it off the grid, and so on and so forth, within a given geographical area. That is happening. And we have to shape the future of Barbados for that to be accommodated legislatively. It is called microgrid technology. That's what it is called, microgrid technology. No, ma'am, you can't pretend that you're talking about a piece of legislation that governs the country for the future if you're not going to speak to what is likely to be our future or what should and could be our future. Now, the issue there is, again, one of making sure that our people have a new set of opportunities. I feel, ma'am, that in the end of the day, we would fail ourselves and we would fail this country if we do not create the opportunity for Barbadians now to be able to generate and sell to each other, and take the natural progress of economics one step further, remove now, to some degree, the sole reliance on the middleman, which is the public utility. I can generate and sell to you, and you can purchase from me within the context of a grid that is superintended by the Fair Trade Commission so that the rates are seen to be fair, to protect all of us as consumers within that geographical space, superintended by the Fair Trade Commission insofar as the standards of service are concerned, so as to make sure that the service that I am being offered and the standards are being met, are adequate, ma'am, and therefore we are less victim, held less hostage to the whim and the fancy of a public utility which has fallen out of favor by many in Barbados. It is unleashing the commercial potential of the country. It is unleashing the creativity of the country. It is unleashing the ingenuity and the investment opportunity of those people who comprise the Barbadian citizenry, ma'am. And it is unprecedented in this part of the Caribbean. And that is why it appeals to me. Now, ma'am, I go further. The legislation is going to introduce licenses for energy efficiency services. Licenses for energy efficiency services. And again, I want to pause because it is important that we recognize that no amount of prescribed notes can help us drill down in the same way that independent thought will help you to drill down. Energy efficiency is something I just alluded to when I talked about the simple bad practice that all of us in Barbados know exists home at us, and know it exists in the public spaces of Barbados, in the government offices. We know it exists in the business houses in Barbados. How many times do we walk out of a room and know nobody else in the room, but you leave the light on? How many times do we know that people are in the hotels in Barbados will leave the hotel for the day, but the air conditioning unit running? We know it. We know it to be true. And we also know that investment in energy efficiency is already taking place in the private sector and in private houses. Because there are some people who realize and have the sense to realize that, look, I can't continue to do it this way. I must try and save a little bit of current because there's a little bit of cost that I can save. And I know wherever I speak, Madam Deputy Speaker, because it was me in my tenure as the Minister of Energy in Barbados who came to this place, I believe it was in 2021 or 22, with the piece of legislation that was created pursuant, and hear me, Madam Deputy Speaker, pursuant to the 2010, hear what I tell you? 2010, 2 not 1 not. Sustainable Energy Framework. In 2010, under the last administration, a Sustainable Energy Framework was created where the commitment was given that 20% reduction in energy consumption was supposed to take place in Barbados. And one of the mechanisms that was being used was supposed to be the phasing out of incandescent light bulbs. 2010. We came to office in 2018. The legislation wasn't there. We came to office in 2018. The legislation wasn't there. But the commitment had been made in 2010. And that is why I talk about the culture of complacency. Because even though we have no control over whether Israel decides to attack the mullahs in Iraq, in Iran, even though we have no control over whether Israel decides to assassinate somebody in Lebanon, we have control over turning off lights in Barbados. We have control over bringing into the country light bulbs, which are energy-saving devices. We have control over that. And to legislate it to make sure that it's not just old talk, but it has to happen, did not take place between 2010 and 2018. I became minister in 2021, I believe, or 2020, and I had to bring that legislation. So I know whereof I speak when I tell you that there is a culture of complacency with respect to energy in Barbados. And it has to be corrected. It is a level of indolence that the country cannot afford. And so this legislation speaks further to the introduction now of licenses being given to the ordinary Barbadian. The ordinary Barbadian who is interested in being creative, who is interested in using his ingenuity and his commercial instinct to go into a business of energy efficiency. And he can bring into the country then and advise people across the country on how you can get, look, your air conditioning unit can automatically be turned off when the door closes. These are the systems that we got. Okay, I advise you on that. I can be a consultant to you as to how you can bring down the amount of money you spend on energy in a month by 20%. I can advise you on that. A new form of business, Madam Deputy Speaker. But these things should have been reasonably foreseeable back in 2013 when the energy bill that we now repeal was drafted, because the 2010 Sustainable Energy Framework existed in 2010. The bill that came to Parliament bore no resemblance to the ambitions of the Sustainable Energy Framework. But how were they governing? If in 2010 you commit to an energy sustainable framework where you want to bring down by 22% energy consumption in Barbados, and you identify certain mechanisms, for example, the use of energy efficiency bulbs, then why is it that the legislation in 2013 is absolutely and definitely silent, Madam Deputy Speaker, on the very same issue that 3 years ago, 3 years before, you had committed the country to? There can be no greater discohesion and dissonance in a policy of governance than that. Now, this legislation that we bring to the House today, ma'am, as I said, especially insofar as the microgrid license is concerned, is also useful philosophically because while the monopoly has been broken, the monopsony, the single buyer concept, the monopsony continued. The single buyer. You're in the hands of a single buyer all the time. And we said, no, that in 2024, there must be in the hands of the consuming public of Barbados choice. That the most empowering impulse is the impulse of choice. I don't have to buy from you, Star. I can buy elsewhere. That is what drives, that is what creates the balance in commerce. That is what causes people to do business in a fair way. That is what emancipates people from the shackles of control by another party, another entity. And in introducing the microgrid licenses, not only do you end the concept of electricity services in Barbados being subject to one purchaser, but you allow then for the fairness to be taken place and the democratization take place in the market with respect to both sales and purchases. Again, entirely in keeping with the commitment of this government made from the very get-go when we said we can democratize this energy sector. Entirely in keeping with the commitment to democratize the energy sector. We also feel very strongly, Madam Deputy President, that the removal of interested persons for the purpose of objections with respect to licensing applications was important. As I have said, there are those who have seen themselves more as obstructionists than interveners, conscientious interveners. There are those who have objected in writing even to the investment made jointly with the Barbados Workers' Union and Sagicor. even to the union carrying along the working class people that it represents and bringing them into the renewable energy sector. Object to that. Object to that. Demanding sight of all the draft legislation as though they are the chief parliamentary council. In draft, though. In draft. I must have sight of it because I'm an objector. Now, the process having been abused is one thing, but the other thing is that the process was unnecessary and repetitive. And I go back to the question, the vital question of how best we facilitate business in Barbados. And that we must get away from this naked nonsense, this bald stupidity on stilts, where you see that business facilitation is only about the large-scale investments in Barbados. There has to be a recognition, ma'am, that you cannot have triplication and duplication of effort in terms of how you are going to ensure fairness in licensing applications. So we had in the ELPA this idea of somebody being an average person come off the street is going to write to the minister. And they're going to say to the minister, I object. And the minister going to hold a hearing with you. And then somebody else going to come and say, I object too. And the minister going to have a hearing with you. And you call for everything that the ministry got. The ministry must vomit out its files. And you, whether you are competent or not, you must have access to them. And so therefore the country, meanwhile waiting, can't get the investment moved forward. It could plunge itself into darkness because some egos are large. No, Madam Deputy Speaker, the fact of the matter was that this administration, from its very initial stages, introduced a new town planning bill and has a new Town Planning Act. And inherent in that act is the opportunity for the public to air its views on any development. And therefore, ma'am, it is a repetitive and an unnecessary barrier to the ease of doing business for new applications which are already going to be scrutinized by the Town Planning Department to now have to go through more public input again. So therefore, that piece will come out of the legislation and we move forward, having safeguarded by the Town Planning Act the inherent right and the desirable right of the public of Barbados to have a voice in new developments. But what we cannot do is fail to have balance. And the balance is that there must be an opportunity to move forward the investment. So you don't move it forward because of bureaucratic failing. You don't move it forward because of regulatory lag. You don't move it forward because every single individual in the country is entitled to act as an intervener and an objector. And then you don't move it forward because you don't have battery storage. But at what stage then would you move it forward? And how far backward are we going to be while others have moved forward? It don't make sense. And that is why, ma'am, this legislation is required to repeal and replace that which took place before and help us with other areas like interconnection and the sale of electricity to the utility, because historically, that too has been a source of deep frustration. Interconnection and sale of electricity to the utility. Anybody in the Ministry of Energy, you could ask anybody. I suspect you could ask from the janitorial staff all the way back up to the permanent secretary. They have talked about it ad nauseum all across that ministry. That a thing called a connection impact assessment by the utility can take from now until the end of time. There have been people who have been on connection impact assessments for years. But it shouldn't be that way, because the utility is a key stakeholder in the process. And I don't say that to be derogatory to the utility. I say that because we have to hold all stakeholders to a standard. And in another incarnation in this place, as Minister responsible for Commerce, I have emphasized the need for this economy to be a standards-based economy. And part of what we fail to do and fail to get right is to hold to account all those who offer goods or provide services to do so within the context of set and specified standards. And if you fail to deliver on a standard, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it becomes a norm and an acceptable practice, that is what stymies our ability to sell the same good or the same services abroad in other people's markets. Because the first rule of international trade transactions is that you only come into my market and do business in accordance with standards I set. But hey, in Barbados we ain't setting a standard. So whereas you get to the point of exporting that which you sell, you're butt up on a problem that you've never confronted before. Because nobody ever forced you to do what you're doing in the context and the confines of set standards. And so too it is even with the management of the grid. That connection impact assessments are essential. Don't get me wrong, they are vital for grid stability. They are an indispensable part of the work that the utility must do. But the utility cannot afford to have people waiting for a year to get back a connection impact assessment. Because those people also have commitments to banks. And that's why we have to get real. Equally, ma'am, the power purchase negotiation. The power purchase negotiations are oftentimes very timely, time-consuming, and often very costly. And they have also, ma'am, been known to have been fraught with tremendous uncertainty for the financial institutions themselves. So that the major part of the concern with financial institutions has been how the power purchase agreement can work. And we have, in order to make it to be a bankable project, and we have now streamlined this. Their time constraints will be built into the legislation for the first time. And again, these things were reasonably foreseeable, in my view, but they are now going to be written into the legislation so that the legislation will have a streamlining of the question of the connection impact assessment and the power purchase negotiation, and that these cannot be dragged on forever by or in the context of the lack of equality in negotiating power between the two sides. Because let us face it, I will not accuse the utility of doing it, but human nature is a strange thing. And if I know that you can only sell to me, and I know that I am generating in competition with you, and you ain't got nobody else to sell to, and that you need a power purchase agreement from me to sell to me, and I generate it and sell it to myself, I can keep you waiting forever. And these are the inherent difficulties in the structure, ma'am, that perhaps were not thought through. But we came into government and found these structures. Either we dismantle the whole thing and start from scratch, which in the context of an IMF program, in the context of a highly indebted economy, would have been a waste of our time and our effort, or we try to make it right as we go forward. The new bill, ma'am, I had spoken to the question of the system's operative function and the monitoring of the market and dispatching of electricity to determine whether the system is being operated in accordance with satisfactory standards and codes. What I did not say was that codes then have to be established. Because in the rhetoric of this sector, people talk about maintaining it in accordance with satisfactory codes, and that the codes will have to be monitored. But what are you monitoring if the code don't exist? Do you know, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the ELPA that we repeal and seek to repeal and replace today did not even have regulations outside of fees? The only regulation they had was regarding fees. So there's no regulatory environment to do any of the things that they talk about. So it was a piece of legislation that really and truly was without teeth, a lame and toothless dog. The leader of the opposition laughs, but that's what it was. Well, you know so too. And teeth have to be written into the legislation. Codes have to be established. But what sense does it make to say that you are going to have the ministry monitoring dispatch and determining whether the system is operated in accordance with standards and codes when there is no code? But who would we be fooling? That big men would come in here and women put on their Sunday finery, their best. You, ma'am, dressed in splendid in your fuchsia, put on your perfume, leader the opposition, the leader the government business, put on her finery, the leader the opposition, put on his powder. And the legislation ain't got no fundamental substrata. There's no code by talking about codes. But what foolishness would that be? But this is what happened when they did the Electric Light and Power Act in 2013. The government of the day. And now, ma'am, we have to establish codes for licensing activities, licensable activities. There has to be a grid code to streamline the interconnection of renewable energy resources. That should have been done ever since before you start having the renewable energy connection. And that is why, because there was no grid code, you were able to have feeder lines that were packed down. Because you could put any amount on the feeder line. And the poor technical experts are saying, but this ain't making no sense. Because the feeder line could carry 5,000 megawatts. Maybe if you push it 5,500. But you want 4,900 and plan to put on 2,000 more. How it can get done? But then there is no code. There is no legislative structure to say stop, hold, enough. So that we had a Wild West scenario. Anybody could do anything they like. It could not work. And that is what brings us here today. I've come divorced from the passion for partisan politics. I have come simply to say to this country that we got to take this sector, which is of indisputable importance to us and indispensably full of indispensable opportunity. Ma'am, a lot more seriously. Again, there is no transmission or dispatch code that could set out the operations or guidelines or any rules for operating the system. And in the absence of a transmission code or a dispatch code, you are telling a public utility that has the right to do its own generation, has the sole right to dispatch, has the sole right, Madam Deputy Speaker, to transmit, because there ain't nobody else with the transmission line away in Barbados. But at the same time, it got to buy from you. And you're saying to them that there's no code to make sure that the transmission is done in a fair manner. I don't think that we have thought the thing through. And it is because of the fact, ma'am, that it was necessary to work this through, as the Prime Minister says, deconstruct and reconstruct, so as to make sure that the system makes sense. Or worse yet, you create a structure where there's no codification, but yet still you expect people to pay penalties. But what would you be paying the penalty for? The leader of the opposition may be many things, but one thing that he is not is unschooled in the law. You cannot have any penalty for an offense, but I'm always kind to you, my friend. And you cannot have any penalty for an offense that don't exist. And the offense could only exist if you had the code. So you contemplate having a penalty for fines. What would you be fining me for if you have not created the code to fine me under? The Latin is correct. And so therefore, this too had to be written into the system. And if it is, and if we did not and do not do that, then, ma'am, we would again be failing ourselves. So the legislation now, as is proposed, will see the code subject to 3-year review, and that is a reasonable period of time for the market monitor, which will be the Ministry of Energy, to be able to study how this thing works, where there are weaknesses that are identified by the stakeholders or captured by the ministry itself. Then those are fed into the system and the administrative system, and then you're able to say at the end of 3 years, look, gentlemen, ladies, this is how we need now to do further adjustments in order to make the system work better. There is some good news as well, because clearly as we go forward, there are some immediate requirements which I think for any serious observer would be self-evident. The operational efficiency of the renewable energy system is important. I think I've said enough today thus far to have made it clear that operational efficiency is critical. Again, Madam Deputy Speaker, these are not things that easily admit or that should ever admit to partisan consideration. The light in Barbados will never belong or should never belong to any one political party. It must belong to us all. And therefore, the need for us to be cognizant of immediate requirements and how we will, and think through how we will finance some of those requirements is important. Now, what are those requirements, you may ask? You may say to me, well, Minister, Senior Minister, what are you talking about specifically? I give you, for example, the need for us to have technical resource personnel, because obviously we are in a sector which is, even as we talk about this new legislation, going to be bringing in new areas where there is nobody in Barbados that is now understood to be a specialist, and the government will have to be able to procure the right pool of persons to lend advice at a policy level and in an administrative capacity to the new things we're talking about. So the storage sector, for example, because storage is now a brand new sector of economic activity under this proposed legislation. Storing a license to store electricity is completely different from a license to generate. So you can have a license where you put down your PV or you put up your wind energy generating capacity and your wind energy generating capacity, and you are generating. But then you may or should be required, given the scale, depending on the scale of what you're going to be generating, to say, hold on, you can't put all of that on the grid right now. You got to put a storage provision in place because you're not going to be contributing to meltdown. So you store some of that, and we will buy it from you later. So you may say, I don't want to store. I don't spend enough money on generating capacity. Somebody else comes along and says, well, listen, I want to invest in storage. I will take your electricity from you and I will store it. And when I'm ready, I will sell it to the utility when the utility wants it. So that itself is a new business endeavor. It is a new form of commercial activity. It is a new form of investment opportunity. And therefore, you have to have the technical resource personnel who can help speak to, first of all, the Fair Trade Commission, which has never had to do any storage tariffs, to be able to say this is what we're looking at for tarification for storage, so that the return on investment is fair and that the consumer's interest as a consumer is protected. And equally then, you have to have the financial resources to support the enhanced administrative responsibilities. Because clearly you've got to do more have more administration over a system that is expanding. It is now beginning to go into stride, and it will sprawl all across the country as people do their microgrids, and they themselves are also involved in new economic activity. They are buying and selling, and their oversight has to be maintained. The tariff or oversight of them has to be maintained. Tariffs have to be set by the Fair Trade Commission. Service standards have to be maintained and superintended by the Fair Trade Commission. The storage sector will be a sector in its own right. Under licenses of its own, there will be storage licenses, and the people operating under them must be superintended equally, and therefore you have to have in the Ministry of Energy and also in the Fair Trade Commission, and quite frankly, the government engineering, EGED, Electrical Engineering Department, persons who are capable and competent to support this enhanced administrative responsibility. So as that creeping requirement for resources takes place, and as you have the need for more resources to superintend appropriate levels of licensing oversight, there's going to be a need, ma'am, for the financing. The legislation contemplates that. And the legislation speaks now to an electricity system benefit fund. And that will be a system benefit fund to independently finance technical and regulatory oversight of the sector, drawing from those who have invested in the sector. Oh, Madam Deputy Speaker, one of the things we have failed to do in energy in Barbados in the past is to appropriately speak for what happens when you decommission the energy plant. We should not have ever forgotten the lessons we learned when, in the absence of appropriate legislative harness, an international oil company came here, very familiar to the leader of the opposition, albeit in a different incarnation. An international oil company came here and pulled up stumps, or I should say kicked down the stumps and down with the game, picked up its bat and went long home, but left it a mess because it did not properly decommission the plant that it had. And though you may not believe it, every energy plant needs to be properly decommissioned. How do you dispose of the equipment when once you decommission it? How do we make sure that it is disposed of in an environmentally satisfactory way? How you ensure that the community is not left with a scarred landscape and an ugly and offensive presence, which is a silent sentinel reminding the community of that which used to be there. These are things that we have to make sure are appropriately spoken to and addressed, and the legislation speaks to that. I also want to say, ma'am, that, look, we have tried to be as inclusive as possible in the way in which we have approached this sector. If I have used the word democratization once today, I have used it 1,000 times. And that is at the core of all that this government has tried to do. I'm not going to say that the government has been pluperfect, but I'm going to say that we have demonstrated beyond any doubt our commitment to the democratization of the sector. And if I was forced, ma'am, to reflect on times when this sector lacked any feeling or sense of democracy, I would take my mind back to 1973. I had said earlier, ma'am, that it was 50 years ago that Brazil moved its energy to renewables. 50 years ago, they put themselves on a renewable energy footing. 50 years ago, Brazil, like us, went through an energy crisis. The energy crisis of the OPEC energy crisis. You remember when, in 1973, 74, when you couldn't get oil but here, when it was rationed. Under a different type of administration, it was rationed. And there were concepts which were previously unthought of, like a privileged pump, where certain friends of the administration of the time were able to go and get petrol, and others who were not so privileged could not. Let us be real. We talk about democratization, not of privileged pumps. Let us be real. We don't ration anything. We try to work to make sure that a cap is placed on the cost, and government, using its girth, stands in the way of a consuming public having to pay more for prices at the petrol. That happened and continues to happen, Madam Deputy Speaker. And therefore, the issue really is the approach that you bring to this sector. We take an approach that it is one of national security and significance and high importance. We also feel that it offers new frontiers of opportunity. I have enumerated many of them. It also unleashes new investment opportunities. And again, I have enumerated many of them. We also feel, ma'am, that it stimulates further employment. And I've given examples of how that employment can be stimulated. It is for us, ma'am, to actualize the full potential of this sector. I believe, ma'am, that we have it within us to be able to achieve that. I believe we have it within us to be able to achieve what is called climate positive growth. You're looking after the climate at the same time as you're growing. And ma'am, that is where this legislation places us. It also puts us on a footing to be competitive. Competitive in a world and in a region that is moving at the fastest pace forward possible towards renewables. And it cannot be satisfactory for Barbados to be kept on pause. So therefore, ma'am, we needed a piece of legislation like this. It addresses in many ways the challenges that the country has been confronting and wrestling with in the renewable energy sector. It will not by itself be, let me repeat, this legislation will not and cannot be expected to be a panacea to solve all of the challenges confronting the energy sector in Barbados. But it takes us a long way forward and embraces new technologies which are evolving, and it incorporates the opportunities for our people to unleash their most creative economic potential and their spirit of ingenuity in an economy which desperately needs more Barbadian presence and more Barbadian participation. I am obliged to you, ma'am. Oh, I beg, ma'am, that the bill be read a second time.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move the suspension of the House until 2 p.m. Madam Deputy Speaker, I beg to move the suspension of the House until 2:15.
Honourable members, the suspension has been Honourable members, the suspension has been asked for until 2:15. Honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Suspension until 2:15 this afternoon.